Italy, where a weakening economic outlook may force the country to delay by a year its plans to balance its budget by the year 2013. A draft document that is to be approved by Prime Minister Mario Monti's cabinet has raised the country's budget deficit forecasts for 2012 through until 2014 and also slashed this year's economic growth outlook. Italy's budget deficit is already one of the lowest in the Eurozone as a proportion of GDP, and many economists say the country's weak economic growth is more of a concern than fiscal slippage. The draft economic and financial document raises the 2012 deficit target marginally to 1.7% of gross domestic product from 1.6%, while the 2013 goal is raised to 0.5% from 0.1%. The nearly balanced budget with a 0.1% deficit is now targeted in 2014. More importantly, the economy is forecast to contract by as much as 1.2% this year, according to the document, compared with an earlier forecasted 0.4% of GDP. All right, then, to get a perspective on the outlook for the Eurozone, particularly Italy, we are joined on the show by Tobias Blattner, who's a European economist at Daiwa Capital Markets. He joins us on the show from London. Tobias, to begin with, Italy has put back its balanced budget goal by a year due to the weak economic outlook. Now, must we assume that the wait for Europe getting back on track is only going to get longer?
Well, I think what Italy really has done now is adjusting its forecasts for economic growth and hence the implication that this has for the budget. So I think it just turns it now a little bit more realistic because it only had penciled in a contraction of the Italian economy of minus 0.4% for this year, which I think was definitely too optimistic. And now the new forecast is a contraction of minus 1.2%, which comes very close to what we also expect. And hence I think it's more realistic now, the new plan to balance the budget only in 2014. But I think that is actually rather good news to the markets rather than bad news, because it takes away a little bit of this bad feeling in the market that too much austerity will not help the economies in the periphery, and hence to smooth a little bit the plan to balance the budget over a longer period, just by 1 year at least, is indeed not that bad news.
Right. Also, Tobias, do you believe investors could give Italian bonds the same treatment they did when Spain dithered on its deficit target and sent yields on its government debt sharply higher?
In Spain, we have a fiscal deficit of 8.5% in 2011 because the previous government had failed to meet the targets of 2011 by a very wide margin. So I think the starting conditions are much worse. And also we have the Prime Minister Monti in Italy, which has a very high credibility in the market. So all of this, I think, will clearly help the Italian bond yields in the market to stabilize at levels below those for Spain and avoid a major sell-off that we have seen once the Spanish Prime Minister has announced that the government has failed to meet the targets. So we are more optimistic about Italy, but nevertheless, even though it has sounder economic fundamentals, I think the fears of a political change at the elections coming up next year in April, these are still present. I think these are probably the major downside factor for Italian bond yields in the near-term future.
Now, Tobias, the International Monetary Fund has said that Italy will not be able to balance its budget at least until 2017. Now, is that a more reasonable target than the revised target of 2014 that Rome is now indicating?
We actually think that the IMF is too pessimistic about Italy, because also it has penciled in the new projections for this year, where a contraction of minus 1.9% for Italy. We think that given the high levels of net wealth in Italy, together with, I think, a banking sector which is more shielded from the developments in the markets because it has a more domestic, retail-orientated business models, we think these factors will actually help to avoid a major recession of the size that the IMF has put forward this year. So we only think that the contraction in economic activity will be around 1%. So given that, I think the IMF is probably too pessimistic on the growth assumptions and hence also on the deficit assumptions. So we are actually confident that Italy can balance its budgets before 2017. Maybe not by the target in 2014, but also not as late as in 2017.
Also, Tobias, just keeping the focus on Italy, do you believe adopting additional corrective measures in order to meet the 2014 target is a good idea, especially considering that the Italian economy is still struggling?
It would probably actually be rather a mistake now to engage in further rounds of fiscal austerity, because we have seen that it is very, very difficult to implement additional fiscal austerity in these very, very difficult times when the markets are facing very constrained access to the markets because of the fears of a recession. So I think the case of Greece has shown very well that the markets are not responding to just the announcement of additional austerity measures, but they are actually rather worried about the impact, the recessionary impact that additional austerity measures have. So, as Prime Minister Monti has already announced that he is not inclined to announce further measures, I think that would rather be a good idea and would probably help to stabilize the bond yields of Italy.
Also, Tobias, just focusing on Portugal, the country's Prime Minister has said that there are no guarantees that the country will return to the international markets before September next year. Now, what would you make of this statement? And do you also believe that given the challenging environment we still are in today, Portugal may be forced to seek a second bailout?
Well, we have said already, I think, for a long time that it is very unlikely that Portugal will be able to return to the international financial markets by the end of next year. That assumption, I think, is just wishful thinking, simply because the yields of Portugal remain at double-digit levels across the curve, actually also at the very short-term end of the curve. So all of this, I think, also the economic contraction in Portugal is likely to be very large this year. We expect a contraction of around 3% and another contraction even in 2013. All of this together makes it very unlikely that Portugal will be able to return to the markets. But nevertheless, Portugal is very different from Greece, so we don't think that there's any need for a private sector involvement in a restructuring of debt. What Portugal simply needs is more time, and hence I think it is just a question of time, probably still this year, that we will see European leaders and the IMF extend the timeline of the current bailout. So,
right, Tobias Blattner, many thanks for coming in on the show and talking to us about the outlook for Italy, Spain, Portugal, and also largely the outlook for the Eurozone going forward.